Christianity and morality, right? The idea of morality coupled with religion and Christianity, those two institutions in and of themselves account for all of this. And instead of talking about a quantum of humanness, instead of talking about human achievement, instead of talking advances in science, advances in math, advances in philosophical insight, what we're doing is we're bitching amongst each other about who's suffering more, right? So that it becomes this sort of really, this phenomenal waste of time, right? It becomes a phenomenal waste of time, and all that's being done is people are arguing about who's suffering, right? Nothing's being done because we already saw from the last point that revenue dollars are just going to bloat the state, right? So it's just like, it really is just banter for the sake of banter, because the money isn't being used to alleviate any of the suffering, right? So think about how infuriating that would be for a scholar to live in a time. I mean, our time isn't that much different. Oh, you know, you turn to Fox, you turn to MSNBC, they're arguing back and forth, banter, banter, banter. Government, where's all of our tax dollars going? People are suffering. A lot of people are talking on behalf of those people who are suffering, but not a lot is being done, especially in the United States of America, right? I mean, let's keep it funky, right? Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, really not too much is being done, right? It's a hard problem. Granted, government's responsibility is not to create jobs, and government's responsibility is not to but government's responsibility probably is to, and now I'm off tangent, but to create a condition in which business can thrive, right? So, you know, maybe there's some middle ground between, you know, what Republicans are saying and what Democrats are saying, but that'll never happen, right? Republicans want an absolute fixed tax rate and to entice businesses, and Democrats, the last thing that they're going to do is to do that because, you know, God forbid we drop taxes for the businesses so that they can, and so on, right? So what ends up happening? Back and forth, suffering, suffering, suffering. We are suffering. We're not talking about suffering because we live it, right? They're talking about it because they don't live it, so that's what they talk about. Money's going up. Yeah, if you really want to get the system fleshed out, right? Money's going up, right? And nothing's coming back down. Money goes up, nothing comes back down. It's conversation going horizontally, and you know, these people eventually die off one by one. But they're replaced, right? They're replaced with new sufferers. And I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because, wow, Nietzsche's a genius, right? He figured it out. He figured it out, right? He figured it out. And I think this still applies, which is why I'm spending so much time going through this text, right? It's freaking insane. I don't even remember where I was. Yeah, so doesn't like Kant, doesn't like Rousseau. He thinks and when you look at the level of analysis that he's doing, sort of in a historical, social sense, it's pretty profound stuff. It's pretty profound stuff. All right, number 3 in this. So he goes through the centuries. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. You know, read the notes for yourself. Note 95 primarily. 17th century is a century for the aristocracy. Right. Number 4. 18th century for Nietzsche is dominated by women. Obviously, he doesn't think that's a good thing. 19th century for Nietzsche is, read, 95. Okay. Yeah, and I do want to talk a little bit about the 19th century. So, 17th century, aristocracy. 18th century, dominated by women. 19th century, this is what he says. This is note 95. If you're following along in the Kaufman, it's page 59. The 19th century is more animalistic and subterranean. Uglier, more realistic and vulgar. And precisely for that reason, better, more honest. So you see immediately, before I go on, you see immediately that Nietzsche, as a great scholar does, is he takes the conceptions linguistically, and I've done a series of semiotics, right? He recognizes that linguistically we've associated pejorative notions with some of these terms, and he's precisely flipped it on its head, right? What's ugly is beautiful. What's beautiful is ugly, right? What's animalistic, what's vulgar is better, right? Is more wholesome, is more real, is more natural, right? More honest, more submissive before every kind of reality, truer, but weak in will, But weak in will, later, in a little bit, I think I'm going to talk about that. Yeah, in a little bit, I'm going to talk about that. So, but weak in will, and that's a very important point. But weak in will, but sad and full and dark cravings, but fantastic. Not full of awe and reverence for either reason or heart. Deep, so a little bit sort of jaded, a little bit what's the word I'm looking at? Jaded is good enough. Not full of awe and reverence for either reason or sort of disinterested, I guess, or heart. Deeply convinced of rules of cravings. Schopenhauer spoke of will, but nothing is more characteristic of his philosophy than the absence of all genuine willing, even morality reduced to one instinct, pity. And this is what's key, right? It's important to recognize that the discussion, and we'll see this later, the discussion of the 19th century is in question, right? What is the discussion of the 19th century? It's a little bit of both. There is forms of decadence, but there's forms of the quantum of humanness, right? There is a sense in which there's been a lot of progress, but there is a sense in which there's been a lot of regress, a lot of regression, thanks to Kant, right? The return in the 19th century to Kant is like going back in time, right? Why are we going back in time? And somewhere in there, I didn't write it in the notes because I didn't know if I was right, but I don't mind saying it. He said something, and I might be able to find it. It's not in my notes, though. He said one of these things, I think I remember it's the top one. Yeah, on page 56, it's note 91. This is not part of the notes, but, and I wasn't even going to bring this up, but I thought it was interesting and it made me think of it. At the top of page 56, note 91, he says, around 1770, the decline of cheerfulness began to take notice. And for me, it was like, Kant's dissertation of 1770, obviously. So it was like, I don't know if that was like a really visceral jab at Kant, why specifically 1770. Just as an aside, if you do know the answer, you probably have to be pretty good at Nietzsche to know the answer to that. But note 91, and again, this just popped in my head. Around 1770, the decline of cheerfulness began to be noticed. And I don't know if that's just like a jab at Kant's dissertation. I don't know what that is in reference to, because there are no footnotes in the book. It's just there. I think it should require a footnote, but anywho. So yeah, bam, 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 bam. All right. Also, for Nietzsche, the 19th century is a regression. This is a note from 102. I jumped ahead a little bit just to flesh out this concept. But for Nietzsche, the 19th century is, quote, a regression, poor in spirit and taste, but progress, darker and more realistic, right? So that with respect to the progress of human civilization in the 19th century, for Nietzsche, Nietzsche sees that there has been progress insofar as we are more animalistic, that we are more vulgar, that we are more ironic with respect to our obligations to duty, this Kantian duty that he hates so much. That we're more pessimistic, that we've grown and we've recognized that our moral imperatives have time and time again, since the beginning of time, been used to control us. And insofar as we shed ourselves of this obligation, that we refuse to be controlled, and insofar as we refuse to be controlled, we embrace freedom, right? And a freedom which is seated in sort of this naturalistic, almost pagan freedom, if you will. That might be going a little too far, but that's what I believe. Alright, so now to really start fleshing out Kant and Rousseau. He talks about a lot of other things. He talks about Wagner in this section. He talks about a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm not going to do any of that. For me, Kant, Rousseau, and that's how I'm going to shape the discourse, right? He talks about Rousseau, I think it's in this section with in opposition to Voltaire, but I'm not going to get into that either, right? What I want to do is sort of look at Kant and Rousseau as the bad guy and set Kant and Rousseau against what Nietzsche is doing in The Will to Power. So Rousseau and Kant as saboteurs of progress is the section title. Alright, so Rousseau and Kant as saboteurs of progress.